turns, real good, clean overhead squat. He needs a little bit more shoulder flexion. Barefoot, no problems. Then his buddy jumps in and helps out. This might be a little bit more restricted. Thud. Sound of his hips clanking off one another. So again, not very good. Let's give him a little bit of external rotation in his feet. See if that hip internal rotation deficit's causing it. We'll open him up a little bit more. Give his adductors more room to breathe here. Slides down, maybe gets a little bit better, not much. Right? So let's bring him right up, put him up on the plates here. Give him some ankle mobility that you would otherwise have in shoes. I bet this gets a lot better. Let's see. Squat's nice and deep, no problem. Smooth down, right? I mean, it could be a lot better still, and he's still pretty locked up, but it just goes to show you that some quick modifications can change things. And, you know, there are lots of different ways to assess. There's not just this one kind of, you know, direct way to do it. I mean, I think Greg Cook's stuff is fantastic. We use bits and pieces of the functional movement screen. I was just reading some great stuff yesterday on the plane ride out here. Obviously, we have the Assess and Correct thing out, which was out. It's pretty thorough, and I wouldn't expect people to do all the different exercises in there, but you kind of just want to make sure that you have a little bit of everything in your assessment arsenal that'll really help you get where you need to be. The stuff that we're going to do is really the stuff that I find myself using all the time. It's quick to the point. I want you guys to kind of appreciate our flavor and, you know, borrow bits and pieces of it as may be appropriate.
So would you train him with a slight heel lift?
No.
Until?
No. To be honest with a guy like this, I'd probably be doing a lot more deadlifting variations and single leg exercises. You know, all right, here's the asterisk. Mike Boyle is a great friend of mine. I love him to death. I think the whole, you know, the death of squatting, don't squat thing got really blown out of proportion. I think Mike is partially influenced by the fact that he deals with a lot of hockey players who, as a general thumb, have disastrous hips. They have very poor hip internal rotation. As a result, oftentimes they can't squat deeply safely. We also know that probably 2/3 of the NHL is playing with a groin strain right now that they just aren't fessing up to it. It's just understood that you deal with that. So sports hernias, more or less tabular impingement, labral tears, groin strains, and adductor shortness, poor psoas function are just the norm for the NHL. It's widely accepted. So I think that's the biggest chunk of Mike's clientele, and for that population, squatting may not be something that is really appropriate. That said, we still squat a lot of our athletes. I think it's very, very valuable, but I'm not married to the idea of squatting. I don't contraindicate exercises, I contraindicate people. So this is a guy I probably would not. Any kind of axial loading I would do with him might be like a reverse lunge with a front squat grip, or forward lunge with the giant camera bar, or something like that. So I'm not really ready to kind of contraindicate one exercise on the whole, but for a guy like this, no, we would. Maybe down the road we would, maybe we would. It's really hard to say without seeing how he came around to the initial adaptations. Other questions? Sure.
How many times do you use, like, say, like the stability ball for like squats and stuff like that? Do you use that
like wall squats,
yeah,
or
like in ball lunges, kind of.
not really ever. No, I'll talk a little bit about that tomorrow morning. That's not to say there isn't a place for it for sure.
Yeah,
but.
like for like more like rehab.
Yeah, I think the big concern is that, I mean, how often do we really squat with a perfectly upright spine? You know, that's a very knee break pattern. What we teach a lot more to our athletes is you got to learn to break with the hips a little bit more. So what happens? You're going to max out that range of motion pretty quickly. When you need to get more range, it's going to be lumbar flexion, right?
Okay.
So sure.
Anatomically, why were you making his legs wider?
Just giving him a little bit more hip internal rotation. So if a guy has a big hip internal rotation deficit, he's going to be uncomfortable in a more neutral posture. Bring him a little bit wider, let him turn those toes out a little bit more. You give more hip external rotation. When you turn those toes out, you give people kind of that false dorsiflexion as well. So it's kind of a segue to elevating the heels and improving ankle mobility.
So then eventually you're progressing them to more of a even stance?
Yes, over time. Really, we don't want people squatting here. You know what I mean? We would never train people like that. And I think that's something Greg talks a lot about. Is that, you know, the ideal really squatting position is probably about 50 degrees externally rotated in both feet, so you're a little bit more opened up. But where it is valuable is that in terms of assessment, it can allow you to identify things pretty quickly and then kind of progress from there. You guys hear me okay in the back? Am I getting any better with this stuff? All right. All right, I'm going to move on to core stability. Let's talk a little about why you need it. You know, a new school of thought is train the core for resisting motion as opposed to actually creating it. So resisting extension, resisting rotation, resisting flexion. I talked a lot about this I wrote a series called Lower Back Savers at T-Nation a while back, and a lot of this was featured in there as kind of the three categories. So it's important for maintaining posture, whether you're throwing a baseball or picking up a car, whatever it may be. So let's talk about the lumbar spine. You guys are aware with some of the stuff that Stuart McGill is postulating now, and you know, it's really been validated in research. If you look at the American Medical Association, in 1981, they put out this doctrine that used spine range of motion, so lumbar spine movement, as a classifying criteria for return to work. So basically the idea was that if your spine moves this much, you're allowed to go back to work. So that basically dictated the treatment protocols. Unfortunately, what we found out later, and really the research has validated now, even though the AMA hasn't updated their regulations, is that spine range of motion is actually positively correlated with injury risk. Meaning that the more your lumbar spine moves, the more likely you are to get hurt. Okay, and there are going to be exceptions to this rule, people who have very stiff joints and things like that. But in a general sense, most people move too much of the lumbar spine and have insufficient mobility of the hips and the thoracic spine. So what do? They throw their back into their butts. They create spine range of motion and spine power, and they should be getting it from their hips and their thoracic spine. All right, so we don't want to produce torque in our lumbar spine. Some interesting stuff to look at that validates some of this. This is a study from Schaefer and Jobe. Jobe's actually the team doctor for the Los Angeles Dodgers now. They looked at studies back in 1993 of 18 professional baseball hitters. So a great example of the crazy rotation that we see in sports. All right, so it's like 712 degrees per second of hip rotation. You see like 3.5 times hip width and stride length during the hitting motion. What do we know? They looked at EMG analysis of 12 muscles during the swing. They found there was no significant difference in activity between the lead and the trail erector spinning during any phase. The same thing went for the lead trail obliques. So what does that tell us? Traditionally, we've been taught we rotate to one side, we have kind of an asymmetrical oblique recruitment, right? One oblique fires and the other one relaxes so that we can achieve that movement. Same way with the erector spinning. But this research actually shows the exact opposite. EMG was identical side to side in spite of the fact that we were rotating here or rotating here, which flies in the face of what logic would tell us, right? And the reason is very simple. The power is all created in the heat in the hips, and this activity allows us to really transfer that force through the lumbar spine and then onto the implement. So this is the truth of whether we're talking about a slap shot of hockey, a swing in tennis, picking up a grocery bag, you name it. It goes across the board. So we don't want to create range of motion here. We want to create range of motion here and here. Sorry. So let's talk about the true role of erectus.